Well, Mark Few made his thoughts about Washington State and Oregon State joining the WCC pretty clear earlier this week, but there is still reason for excitement about this 2-year development for the WCC.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. And folks, I am thrilled to be joined today by Zach Farmer. Zach hosts the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, talking all things West Coast Conference basketball on the show. Zach and I are going to talk about the impending editions of Washington State and Oregon State for this upcoming season. We're also going to talk about next year's editions of Grand Canyon and SeattleU, what this conference is going to look like, what scheduling might look like, all that good stuff. And then we're going to close out the show talking about the Gales of St. Mary's, a couple tough losses for them in the transfer portal, but some nice building blocks coming in as well. We'll talk about what that might look like for Randy Bennett's team. Zach, let's start with the two newcomers for this upcoming season, a 2-year deal to have both Washington State and Oregon State in the conference. We've talked about it quite a few times on the podcast already, of course, but recently Mark Few did a press conference ahead of his time going to the Olympics, and he made it pretty clear that part of the frustration that Gonzaga had when they initially stopped scheduling Washington State as a non-conference opponent about a decade ago was feeling like they had a precious few non-conference games to be able to schedule, wanted to make sure they were prioritizing or maximizing those. And when asked about Washington State and Oregon State joining the conference this time around, he basically said, it's taken away some non-league games from us. Didn't seem particularly thrilled. Majority of people kind of talking about these two teams joining the conference have been more or less excited. They're bigger brands. They're big, they have a huge donor base, all that good stuff. But we've kind of seen the reasons that some of the staff might not be super happy about this. Where are you kind of at with these two programs coming into the West Coast Conference, specifically from a basketball perspective?
I mean, it is a good addition to have these two come in for the league as a whole. I get why definitely on the Gonzaga front, there is a little bit more trepidation because these are not exactly two schools that leap out when it comes to basketball prowess on a year in, year out basis. Right. Obviously, we've seen Washington State have their high a year ago. We've seen Oregon State have a high a few years ago where they got deep into the tournament, but that's not the norm for either of these two programs. It's not a sport that either of those two schools prioritize, but at the same time, you still get a lot. You have more eyeballs on the conference. And for the rest, I think for the vast majority of the league, even Gonzaga to an extent, almost kind of like once more of those eyeballs are on Gonzaga against because there are plenty of haters out there for Gonzaga as well. As far as like saying like, oh, you play in this little conference that plays nobody. Well, here's two teams that played with a bunch of somebodies and they're getting their teeth kicked into, then it's it's validating not only for Gonzaga, but for St. Mary's, for USF, for Santa Clara. Santa Clara beat Washington State last year. Not forget that that's still a Santa Clara squad who maybe underperformed overall because we thought they had the talent to do more. But that's a team that beat a Washington State that was in the tournament a year ago.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, Mark, you mentioned was the regional aspect of it, which I think is a positive, obviously, for Gonzaga in particular. And I think you're absolutely right of like, there's going to be a whole bunch of Gonzaga fans at the Gill Coliseum in Corvallis when they played Oregon State. But there's also going to be a lot of Oregon State fans who are like, hey, this is an exciting opportunity for us to see somebody that's not, Arizona or UCLA or some of the other big programs they've had in the past, but another regional program that we don't often get to see. And I think that's an exciting element for Oregon State basketball fans. It's exciting for Oregon area Gonzaga fans. I know personally, I'm close friends with a lot of people who work at the University of Portland. And I always thought of this like, oh, this is another positive for them too. It's actually kind of not, because they make a lot of their money on how many people go to the Portland Gonzaga game in Portland. And now that there's another opportunity in the state for them to see them in conference play, it actually could be a negative for them. So it's interesting to see some of the pros and cons from a variety of different programs. But I think ultimately it's hard to deny that this makes the basketball in the WCC better. It doesn't improve it as much as it could, especially because Oregon State really isn't bringing a whole lot. And we'll talk about them in a second. But the other problem is Washington State. I mean, you can look and say, okay, the WCC is adding a program that was a 7 seed last year that had a lot of success in the Pac-12, but it's not the same team. I mean, it's not any of the same team. It's Kyle Smith's gone. He goes to Stanford, a move that now is a WCC to ACC move, which is very bizarre. And the whole team's gone. Everybody's gone. And David Riley comes in from Eastern Washington, brings a handful of his guys with him. We've seen an Eastern Washington coach take a job in the WCC and bring a lot of their talent with them, and that was the University of Portland. And outside of their first year under Coach Leggins, that's not a team that has done all that much. I'm a little bit more optimistic that Washington State won't end up following the same path as Portland. But where are you at with what this pretty new look, I mean, not pretty, incredibly new look Washington State team is going to look like in their first season in the conference?
Yeah, it's again, you mentioned it. Like, we've kind of seen this story before. We've seen this play out before, where an Eastern Washington head coach takes over a WCC program, brings in some of their guys, and it works in year one.
Yeah.
At least I think what Portland finished, I think 5th or something like that in the conference that year, 5th or 6th. They were a good team in the conference that year, but it wasn't something that was sustainable. Now, I agree. Washington State has way more resources to be able to support this program, so I don't think you're going to see that level of a drop off. So I do still see Washington State as being kind of like a mid-tier WCC team right now. Now, one of the other additions I do really like was Nate Calmes coming in from Washington. His addition is going to be, I think, a really good fit for what they're going to try to do in league play. He was former Southland Conference Freshman of the Year, so this is a guy who knows how to have success on the floor. And coming from Washington, he did it 15 against, I think, Arizona last year. So again, guy who there is some proven track record on what he could do. But you also look at what the rest of the WCC has done, because again, Gonzaga and St. Mary's are still 1A, 1B in this conference, and there's still no like separation of that. USF and Santa Clara have a lot of pieces coming back from a year ago, and those are 2 20-win teams from a year ago. And this is a group that luckily was able to stick together. So just because looking at those pieces, it feels like Washington State, because of the continuity, all the new pieces, and the Eastern Washington kind of template we've seen in the past, it really makes me think that they're going to be like stuck right in the middle of the conference this year.
Yeah, that's probably where I'd project them too, just without having done a full deep dive on the rosters yet. I'm sure we'll get into that some of their time later in the offseason. But yeah, I think Wazoo's 5th, 6th, somewhere in there, could certainly contend for higher. It wouldn't shock me if they do. If they finish 4th, I'd be pretty surprised at 3rd. But 4th, 5th, 6th feels reasonable. Anything lower than 6th, I think, is a pretty disappointing first year for them. But it's not the same conversation we're having with the team in Corvallis with Oregon State. I mean, they have not been good the last couple of years. Wayne Tinkle really rode that Elite Eight appearance in 2021, I think it was, has really kind of helped catapult or kept him at that staff. But things have gone really bad since then. And this last year's team, they weren't good last year. Their best player, Jordan Pope, has transferred to Texas. They lost a handful of other players in the portal. Like, this is a program that it's I'm not sure how much longer you can keep Wayne Tinkle. You can allow him to not succeed in the Pac-12, but if this program moves to the WCC and doesn't finish higher than 7th, which I don't see them finishing higher than 7th or maybe even 8th, at some point I think you got to start considering making a change. And I'm having a hard time seeing them be that competitive in the WCC next year.
I will give them a little bit more credit, because you look at the bottom of the WCC, and I don't know if they're going to be slipped that far down, because then you're looking into being in the conversations with Portland or with Pacific or with Pepperdine. And I think Pacific, I think, is going to be a little bit of a surprise this year, but the others, like, they're so far away, I think, from the rest of the pack. San Diego, I think right now you could also throw in with that group. So I'm going to give Oregon State a little bit more credit, because they're not that bad. But yeah, looking at their roster, looking what they have, they're bringing back some decent pieces that are going to help. And some of the transfers, you do have Tyler Cochran coming from Toledo. He was the MAC Defensive Player of the Year last year. So you do have some talent, some good talent coming in, but it's really just a matter of, like, because this wasn't a program that was successful in the Pac-12, and we've seen WCC teams be very competitive with those later versions of the Pac-12 schools in the last few years. So it's not like that the talent level was that different between the two leagues. Like USF and Santa Clara, LMU are competitive with Pac-12 teams, what the past Pac-12 teams.
Right.
And so Oregon State being in this group is, again, kind of like Washington State. Like, I think they're going to be stuck in that mid-tier window, maybe a little lower than Washington State, but that's kind of about where they are right now until proven otherwise, because the rest of the WCC teams above them, in my mind, have just better track records of success.
Well, Washington State and Oregon State are the two teams joining this year in the WCC, but they're not the only two teams that are about to be newcomers into this conference. Zach and I are going to discuss Grand Canyon and SeattleU, both set to join the conference as more permanent members starting in the 2025-26 season, and that's going to come up right after a word from today's sponsor, Gametime. Folks, minor league baseball season is underway. I live about 10 minutes away from the Hillsboro Hop Stadium, and I love being able to make a last-minute decision to head out to the ballpark. And that's why I use Gametime, because prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned that you're going to get fake tickets from a third-party buyer, you're going to show up to the stadium, your ticket's not going to work, it's super embarrassing. One of the nice things about Gametime is your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. And personally, I love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Folks, $25 to get to two tickets to a Hops game. You can go for $5 if you download Gametime today and use promo code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Zach, segment 2 here, moving on, continuing our conversation about WCC conference expansion and realignment. We talked about Washington State and Oregon State both joining the conference this upcoming season. For those who need a reminder, they will be in the conference for the next 2 years as affiliate members in every sport except, of course, football, which the WCC does not have, and baseball, where those two programs are choosing to be independent for now. They'll be here for basketball, men's side, women's side, a lot of other sports. It's going to be great. Starting in 25-26, we will not only still have Washington State and Oregon State for one more season, we will also have Grand Canyon and SeattleU, who are joining as full members in the conference. They are officially going to be members of the WCC going forward. I've had the opportunity to speak to both Chris Victor, the head coach at SeattleU, as well as Bryce Drew, the head coach at Grand Canyon. Got to hear some of their initial thoughts and reactions about coming into this conference. But I want to talk to somebody who covers the WCC, who kind of gets an opportunity to look at what this means more from the West Coast Conference perspective, because once again, I think the Gonzaga side and the perception for what this means for Gonzaga is probably a little different than the perception that people who maybe just more broadly talk about the conference feel. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on these two programs joining this conference next season.
I mean, I think when the announcement came out on about a month and a half ago now, it was definitely not a surprise. It was just I think the two schools have been talked about for so long as being potential new members of the WCC, and clearly this is something that Commissioner Stu Jackson has been working on for a while with both of those schools. And on a competitive, I think in two different ways, they make sense in various ways. Grand Canyon, I know there's a lot of question marks about their accreditation, the academic side, all of that. But on a competitive front, you cannot deny that Grand Canyon is one of the fastest risers in all of college basketball.
Yeah.
They have the right head coach. They have the right support system. Their fans are nuts. Like they are building a basketball program that is already clearly in the conversation now as one of the better mid-major programs in the country right now. And that is nothing but a good thing for the WCC. And it's also a program that wants to be part of the WCC. I think that's the other thing that we really have to kind of think about. BYU, when they came in, it was like, it was very much supposed to be a stopgap. Like they did not, I don't think they intended to be in the WCC for as long as they were. But Grand Canyon is a program, because they don't have football, This is their focus. This is their primary sport. And it is an exciting program to actually have in, even though, again, like all the legal and court stuff aside, on the academic front, athletically, they make so much sense for the WCC. My only concern is if Bryce Drew is even going to be here in 2 years with the successes they've had. Now, I think they'll have enough money to be able to match whatever another school is going to put out there. But I think that's my one question mark about Grand Canyon by the time they enter the WCC. SeattleU, the situation with them, like, they are the perfect fit. Like they check off so many of the other boxes that the WCC looks for. They check off the academic box. They check off the small school box. They check off the so many of the other boxes that, like, this is a school that aligns with our values. And I think that was a huge thing for a lot of the WCC schools. I think that was part of almost the agreement that if we take Grand Canyon, you have to take Seattle. So it balanced those two out, because the SeattleU, again, their men's basketball program has done well over the last few years. This isn't like maybe you can make some level of alignment of, like, well, look at what Pacific was right before they came in, which is a fair question mark about that program. And we know what Pacific has looked like over the last decade. It has not overall looked good, but it's a program that adds both of these programs add two more major markets into the WCC geographic landscape. You add Seattle, you add Phoenix. This adds major markets and major players into the WCC. And really, now you look up and down the West Coast, the league has a team in almost every major market up and down the coast.
Yeah, that was my big argument with SeattleU. I also never hit on the show that I'm an alumni of SeattleU as well as Gonzaga, so I had a lot of extra motivation to want them to be in the conference. But you go San Diego, you go LA, you go San Francisco, you go Portland, you go Seattle. Like, those are your major cities along the West Coast. There's Jesuit Catholic small schools in every single one of those cities. And for the longest time, Seattle was the only one that didn't have a team in the West Coast Conference, because you had LMU representing the LA area, San Diego, San Francisco, and Portland, of course. So it always felt like they just logically fit, and they're coming off 3 straight 20+ win seasons. Like, I think that the direction of that program is in a good spot. And I think I want to go back to the very first point that you made, because I think that's a key part of this is you're adding teams to the WCC that want to be here. That hasn't been the BYU didn't really want to be here. Oregon State and Washington State don't really want to be here. I think they're grateful that they have a place to house their sports. I don't think that they're like sticking their nose up at the WCC the way that it at times felt like BYU was doing. I don't get that impression from Washington State or Oregon State. And I also totally understand why they don't want to be here long term. I think the relationship for Washington State and Oregon State with the WCC is kind of a more pragmatic one. It just kind of makes sense. It's logical. It's not the long-term solution, but everybody's on board with that. But it's nice for the conference to also go get teams that actually want to be here, and to be able to add teams that want to be in the WCC and that also are good basketball programs. I mean, that's the lottery. That's as good as you can realistically do. And I'm not going to gloss over the fact that Grand Canyon, there are questions about the university specifically. And I think that is something that merited a lot of conversation and discourse among the presidents and athletic directors. And I'm sure that it did. And I think you're right that SeattleU was sort of a kind of pushed in there alongside them to kind of appease some of those people who had consternation about that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Stu Jackson's also an alum of SeattleU, so he may have thought this is kind of the perfect way to get them in there, but they are a logical fit and they want to be here. And I think that matters a lot. But one of the other questions that comes out of this is what the heck the conference schedule is going to look like. Because for one season, there's going to be a whole bunch of teams in the WCC. The last year that Oregon State and Washington State are in, the first year that Grand Canyon and SeattleU are going to be in. Are we going to see the WCC attempt to get a 20-game schedule? Because Mark Few is going to be red in the face angry about that. And so is most of the people listening to this podcast. Like, that is not going to go over well for the Gonzaga faithful. I have to imagine even some of the other programs in the conference, potentially even St. Mary's, are not going to be thrilled about losing the opportunity to schedule up some big non-conference games. Yeah. But I'm not sure what else they're going to do here.
I mean, I was kind of mapping it out a little bit, like thinking about what the schedule was going to look like. Because going into this year, I think it was pretty obvious that it was going to have to move back up to 18. With 11 teams back in the league, you kind of had no choice but to push it back up a couple of games, which made sense. I think you can still keep it at 18, knowing that it's going to go back to 11 the following year. There's no reason to jump at the 20 for the 1 year and just throw kind of things out of whack. What I think that would end up doing, if I did the math correctly, rather than just having 2 teams that you would only play once, I think it goes up to 4 teams you would only play once. So kind of doing the similar style that you currently have with the 18 team schedule. You just have to apply it with more one-offs on that schedule, which again, I think is going to be at least more peaceful. Actually might be even more appeasable to the Gonzagas or the St. Mary's, because then you don't have to, if you're still 1-2, then you don't have to play 13, 12, 11, and 10 more than once. And I think that's, again, like that allows you to still add some of those better non-conference games. Now, okay, maybe you don't get to add any NIAA schools or like low major schools onto that to have at least like some of those easy bye games, but you still at least don't have to play the lower tier of the conference as much. And yes, I know that's a little bit of a bad thing for the lower teams. Like the Pepperdines won't get to see Gonzaga twice or St. Mary's twice. They'd only get one at home rather than both of them at home. So I know that's one of the challenges for those programs, but I think for the conference overall, 20 is too many. 20 is too much.
Yeah, I'm 100%. And if you're Gonzaga and and we're looking ahead to this, if that's the plan, it's like, okay, you're going to add 2 games against Grand Canyon because you're going to get them twice. So you add 2 games against Grand Canyon and you remove a game against Portland and a game against, I don't know, Oregon State or Pepperdine or Pacific or somebody like that. Like that's a decent trade. Like I think you're okay. Or SeattleU, you only get 1 against SeattleU, but you get 2 against Grand Canyon. Like I think that the trade-off is still going to make Gonzaga's schedule better for that 1 year. But yeah, if you're trying to propose a 20-game schedule, I think you're right. A conference like the WCC, even just for 1 year, they just can't do it. I just don't think it's going to be realistic for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's too many challenges. Also, because because I don't think it hurts Gonzaga and St. Mary's as much because they've been able to schedule so well in the non-conference, and they've done well with those non-conference schedules. The teams that's going to hurt is probably like the Santa Claras, the USFs, the LMUs. Those are the schools that are going to have a harder time with playing that 20-game schedule because while they have been able to schedule well over the last few years, we have seen that they have not been able to cash in nearly as often on those opportunities. And so they need more of those chances to put those games on the schedules to be able to kind of make their resume better and maybe get back as an at-large to the NCAA tournament.
Want to talk about St. Mary's a little bit here, Zach, because the obvious headline storyline for St. Mary's this offseason has been the departures of Aidan Mahaney, who hits the transfer portal, goes to UConn, the departure of Joshua Jefferson, which happened early in the offseason. He goes to Iowa State. It's hard to not feel concerned about those 2 things happening. And we can talk about the players returning and some of the incoming guys and maybe some optimism around next season's St. Mary's team. And I think there's reason to still believe that Randy Bennett and company are going to figure it out and they're going to have a good year. But the overall just perception and kind of concern about the new era of college athletics and seeing these 2 fantastic players, homegrown kids, leave the program after a couple of years to go to the Big East, to go to the back-to-back national champions, and then for Jefferson to go to a team that's probably going to be in the top 5 in Iowa State. Like, it's great to know that your players can succeed at that level and are being pursued by programs at that, top 5 programs like UConn and Iowa State are. But long-term, this has to feel a little bit, at least kind of angst-driven for St. Mary's going forward.
I think it was definitely angst-driven for about 2 weeks there, right after, especially after the Mahaney news, because that was the one that maybe came out of nowhere, and that was the big shock of definitely the West Coast college basketball offseason was his announcement that he was going to take off. But I think St. Mary's has done a very good job of replenishing the well. It's not like that they weren't able to do anything. They themselves took advantage of decommittals and moving around, picking up Liam Campbell who was a previous USC commit out of Idaho. That's a big one. Getting Ashton Hardaway from Memphis is another big one. Again, you look at names and just like seeing the Hardaway name on a transfer is big news, especially when he left his dad. Like he was with his dad in Memphis, and he chose to come to St. Mary's. And he probably had the conversation with Penny that that he wasn't going to see a lot of playing time or whatever else, and then he makes that decision. And sure, like that's where like coaches definitely talk with each other of like, oh, you'd be a good fit at this school or whatever else. I could definitely see that conversation happening. But I think that there's a lot of the attention obviously goes to those two players, but I also think that, I mean, I've said this periodically that, I mean, the one challenge that St. Mary's had going into the last couple tournaments is that, I mean, Aidan Mahaney hasn't played all that well in any of the tournament games in the last 2 years. And so if anything, on that front, while he had the highest of highs and he was a Zag killer the last couple of years, overall, I mean, there wasn't that consistency, I don't think, that we thought we would see in year 2. And I think part of that was because defenses started keying in on him earlier on and all these other things, but it was a bit of a sophomore slump. He had way more ups and downs this past year. I wish the kid all the best that he's going to be able to kind of figure that out at UConn, because I don't think defense are going to be able to key in on him nearly as much as they could when he was in Moraga. But I mean, the St. Mary's team, they always figure it out. Randy Bennett always figures it out. You still have Augustus Marshallonis. You still have Mitchell Saxon. You still have some key pieces from the squad. I'm really high on Jordan Ross. I think Jordan Ross is going to be very good this year. So there's definitely there was early trepidation, definitely some big red flags early on, but I think the rest of the offseason has definitely calmed the St. Mary's fan base down and has had them have them a little bit more confidence going into the year.
Yeah, and I think, Randy Bennett and St. Mary's have kind of followed the Gonzaga trajectory in a way. One of the things I talk about a lot with Gonzaga is their ability to consistently be somewhat on the kind of cutting edge of roster construction in college athletics. They identified using getting international talent before a lot of other programs did, using the grad transfer before a lot of other programs did. Like, there's a lot of ways that they have kind of built their program to stay sustainable, even in an era with now basically pay for play and transfer portal and everything like that. And we've seen Randy Bennett and St. Mary's often find ways to succeed. And one of the areas that I've always been continually impressed by Bennett is the guard development in that program is extraordinary. It seems like every freshman guard who comes in, if they stick it out, they're a star by the time they're a 4th or 5th year guy. It's just, I mean, even if they're walk-ons like Tommy Kusi was, like, regardless, they're going to be successful. And so for me, if you can continue to do that, you're going to find ways to stay successful, even if you're losing players to the transfer portal, even if your NIL budget is maybe not the same as even comparable programs in the conference. Like, I don't know if Randy Bennett and the Gales have as much money as even some of the teams in the WCC, but they're able to find the talent that works for them, develop the talent that works for them. And so I personally am not super concerned about the long-term viability of St. Mary's. And I think just looking ahead at next season, you mentioned it, Marshallonis is back, Saxon's back. They got some freshmen coming in. They got Hardaway coming in. They got the Arizona transfer coming in. Like, it feels like this team is still going to be in that spot competing at the top. Like, Gonzaga has a lot of, they were very fortunate to return basically everybody that they could. And I think that they are going to be the clear favorite going into the season, because people are going to look at Gonzaga's roster stayed mostly the same. St. Mary's lost 2 of their 4 best players. They're not going to be picked ahead of Gonzaga. I think it's fair to say at this point, it's very unlikely that people will pick St. Mary's above Gonzaga like they did last year, but I'm not going to pick St. Mary's any lower than 2. And I don't see, as much as I like what Santa Clara has done this offseason, what LMU has done this offseason, what San Francisco has done, St. Mary's to me is still pretty clearly my number 2. Is that where you're at with them right now?
Yeah, I think so. Because again, like, I can't use, last year I used the argument of continuity as being the reason I would pick St. Mary's over Gonzaga. So this year I very much cannot use use continuity as an argument against Gonzaga, because they have the continuity, I think, further through the roster than St. Mary's does as of right now, especially when you look at the fact, and again, you lose one of the starting 5. That's it. You bring in someone who's familiar with the conference, Michael Ajayi. It's like, again, the complete roster construction. This is a much deeper Gonzaga team. Yeah, it's 1-2. It's Gonzaga, St. Mary's for me right now. based on the continuity and what Gonzaga's been able to do this offseason, and just maybe not full question marks, but definitely like kind of a wait and see on some of the guys on St. Mary's squad on what that's going to look like, because you know what you're going to get from Marshallonis, you know what you're going to get from Saxon, you know what you're going to get from Luke Barrett. It's a matter of what are you going to get from the rest of the pieces.
Yeah. Well, Zach, that was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to future conversations this offseason where we can look at maybe who's 3 through 7, and then who's going to round out the rest of the WCC. We still got some roster construction to be done. I'm sure we'll have multiple other conversations between now and the start of the season. Always love having you on and your expertise on the West Coast Conference. So thanks again for hopping on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast today and this week. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back next week. Got some guests lined up for some pre-draft stuff with Anton Watson. We're going to also cover the draft, see where Anton Watson goes, see where San Francisco's Jonathan Mobo goes. We'll talk about that and then get you ready for the Olympics coming up after that. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, have a great weekend and go Zags.